Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 8B of Series 9. The question for today is, does Spinoza's ethics have anything to offer modern moral philosophy? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 1. Now, my basic philosophical question is again, what can we do with human existence as consciousness? I answer in terms of value and the will to value, leading to a certain sufficiency of value. And because ethics is about values, I look to ethical theory to help me understand values. We have looked at many theories of ethics such as virtue theory, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics. Yet there are many other theories of ethics like emotivism, expressivism and contractualism, as well as existentialist and postmodernist theories of ethics. And thinkers like Rawls, Parfit, Nagel and Dworkin also have their own theories of ethics. Today I want to examine Spinoza's ethics. I had not intended to do a podcast on Spinoza's ethics, as I've previously found it to be unconvincing. But thinking about it, I needed to put my thoughts in order to find out why it was unconvincing. So this is the motivation behind this podcast on Spinoza's ethics. So today's question is whether Spinoza's ethics has anything to offer modern ethics. Spinoza, 1632 to 1677, came earlier than other modern philosophers like Locke, Kant and Hume. So we might suspect that his thought lacks these and even more modern critiques. And despite its intricacies, that is what I find. So we can conduct an analysis of Spinoza's ethics in two ways. One is how Spinoza's principles and premises can be criticized from a more modern point of view. Another is a consideration of the issues that he overlooked because he wasn't aware of them. We can start by noting some of Spinoza's beliefs that are heavily criticized in the modern world. These include Spinoza's objectivist, rationalist and cognitivist account of ethics and moral values. Such views are still widespread today, but not so dogmatically and not without criticism. For example, Spinoza believed in immutable and objective ethical principles to guide moral action. But with respect to belief in God, Spinoza had been thought of as progressive for his time, and his novelty of thought has posed the question of whether he is a pantheist or an atheist. This is because he regards God as the organizing principle and driving force underlying nature. Yet he still defines God as, I quote, a being absolutely infinite, that is, a substance consisting of an infinity of attributes, of which each one expresses an eternal and infinite essence. That is, God is the infinite and necessarily existing substance of the universe. This is the God of the philosophers rather than the personal God of theologians. And this is Spinoza's God that Einstein said that he believed in. Yet Spinoza can still speak of the intellectual love or for God. And we can ask why he has to use the idea of God at all. One reason why Spinoza needs the idea of God is to support his pantheistic metaphysics that animates the world. He calls this the cognitivist principle that everything insofar as it is in itself endeavours to persist in its own being. What he means here is that, I quote again, any individual thing or event, any particular form or shape, which reality transiently assumes. The pantheistic animism evident here isn't something that I or modern thought can assume. That is, this is the idea that there is an underlying metaphysical force driving events in the world that Spinoza calls God. In one sense, it is a rationalized remnant of a Judeo-Christian God that is beginning to lose its credibility. That is, the processes of matter and life have now been largely explained by science in the modern world. Yet Nietzsche had already rejected this view as the illusion of the world behind the scene. But Spinoza's relation with the idea of God isn't just a rationalized remnant of a Judeo-Christian idea. Spinoza's God underpins his whole metaphysical and moral system, without which his system will fail. So we will examine these different metaphysical aspects in that light. The cognitivist aspect of this rationalist ordering of the world is evident in his account of the greatest good for man. He defines this as the knowledge of the union that the mind has with the whole of nature. And his concept of nature is, of course, a pantheistic amalgamation of nature with God. But in addition to the problem of justifying a belief in a pantheistic God, or indeed any God, and the incredible idea of a union of the mind with nature, there is also the problem of defining the greatest good in cognitivist terms of knowledge. The idea of knowledge is a cognitivist human objective was common in classical times, but it is challenged by Hume, the Romantic movement, and in the modern cognitivist, non-cognitivist debate. Briefly put, knowledge isn't adequate as a phenomenal end in itself experience. And Spinoza's cognitivism is an aspect of the rationalism that was more prevalent in his era than it is in the present time. For example, in the first part of his Ethics, he lays out 15 rationalist or logical and metaphysical propositions. These are about metaphysics and the world, which in Spinoza's view is a manifestation of God. One of the consequences of this rationalism is that he saw reason and emotion in opposition to each other, and he saw the future emancipation of mankind in terms of reason overcoming emotion. This is a classic rationalist position. He writes that the impotence of man to govern or restrain the emotions are called bondage. For a man who is under their control is not his own master, but is mastered by fortune. And he regarded the emotions or passions as keeping mankind imprisoned. He identifies 3 primary passions as joy, sadness, and desire. Yet Spinoza offers a way out through the emotions, guided by reason, with what he calls adequate ideas. And conversely, what prevents our emancipation is false or inadequate ideas, that is, from sense perception. But in Spinoza's view, true ideas arise from a knowledge of something present in all things and in all human beings. This knowledge is about ideas that are eternal, complete, adequate, and not subject to change. That is, they are, as he says, sub specie aeternitis, or absolute and eternal. Needless to say, absolute or eternal ideas viewed through a realist epistemology cannot be countenanced in the present time. This is a deeply religious and Platonic view that has been challenged and rejected by many arguments. I previously outlined some of these, including an anthropocentric account of truth. Remarkably, Descartes' rationalism led him to believe that we could know God exists by reason alone. Even more remarkably, Spinoza believed that in principle we can know God completely and perfectly. He wrote, "The human mind has an adequate knowledge of God's eternal and infinite essence." Again, the word adequate for Spinoza means perfect. And that perfect knowledge is attainable through nature, that is a manifestation of God. But this normative conception of nature as a manifestation of God isn't plausible given our current understanding. That is, the nature of living things is full of evolutionary glitches or possibilities that needn't have happened, and the nature of physical things is explicable in pragmatic terms of what works. But for Spinoza, the natural world is the only one that could possibly exist. The idea of other universes or another physics inside black holes is inconceivable to him, I think. Yet underlying this view is a conception of the totality of things as an indivisible unity. And within this unity, everything is integrated: God, nature, and people that he sees as modes. Yet sidestepping problems of this view, Spinoza provides geometry as an example of a type of eternal knowledge. To oppose this, there's no need to discuss anthropocentric theories of maths that Heidegger and Wittgenstein had. Neither is there a need to mention Russell's and Whitehead's attempt to prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2, even though Spinoza wasn't aware of such subjectivist considerations. I think it's more significant to draw attention to the irrelevance of mathematics and logic to ethics. That is, mathematics, physics, and ethics are different domains that operate under different principles. These differences have been demonstrated by both Hume's principle and Hume's fork. Hume's principle is that a prescriptive moral ought can't be derived from a factual is, nor morals from reason. And Hume's fork makes a radical distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact and existence. Matters of fact or scientific laws are discovered empirically and contingently and can be wrong. Yet a stronger case against Spinoza's metaphysical unity can be made by defining three basic aspects of the world. These are physics, logic or mathematics, and consciousness or value, attested to by Popper and indeed Kant. Firstly, logic or mathematics employs a priori methods to discover necessary relations between abstract entities. Then physics employs a posteriori observations to discover contingent relations between physical objects. Yet unlike physics and logic, values and moral values are subject to judgment, choice and graduation. For example, I can legitimately value my father's life over someone else's that I don't know. Or if I give $5 to charity, it's not 10 times more ethical to give $50 to charity. But Spinoza also believes in an underlying moral order in which different domains are in harmony. He writes that since reason demands nothing contrary to nature, it demands that everyone love himself and seek his own advantage. and what is really useful to him will lead a man to greater perfection. There are a couple of interesting ideas here, in addition to a harmony between reason and nature. One is an application of his cognitivist principle, stating that everything should drive to preserve itself. And in the case of human beings, this is expressed in the form of self-love. It is of course contentious as to what self-love can mean, ranging from egoism to altruism. But for Spinoza, this seeking of one's own advantage will lead to a greater perfection, and in this respect Spinoza is an ethical egoist. Yet consistent with Spinoza's belief in universal harmony, he doesn't see self-love being in conflict with others. This is because in his view, what is good for man must include harmonious social relationships. And it's supposedly only under the sway of the passions that self-love conflicts with others. But against Spinoza's optimism, rational conflicts of interest are not hard to find. Yet the idea of perfection here is also significant, as it implies an objective conception of the ideal human. But again, the modern evolutionary conception of mankind is of an as yet undefined work in progress. The existentialist view that existence precedes essence is a strong expression of this view. That is, mankind doesn't have a fixed nature, but people make themselves through their choices. We can also mention here a difference between Plato's and Spinoza's classical definitions in terms of essences. Modern definitions are made in terms of functions and properties, as in what does it do and what is it made of. But it is part of Spinoza's cognitivist principle that everything seeking to persist in its own being is nothing else than the actual essence of that thing. So in Spinoza's framework, things are understood in terms of their essences. Spinoza's understanding of God and metaphysics also leads him to reject the idea of free will in the usual sense. Spinoza denies that God creates the world in an arbitrary or an undetermined act of free will. God could not have done anything else, and this must be the best and only possible world. This is so because everything is absolutely and necessarily determined. Spinoza is committed to the determinist tenet that every effect has a cause for two reasons. Firstly, Spinoza is a rationalist who holds that everything is, in principle, explainable or intelligible. Secondly, he is committed to naturalism, that there are no explanations or causes outside of nature. This usually means that there are no supernatural causes or explanations, but this seems difficult to square with his metaphysical conception of God. Yet Spinoza consequently writes that there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to will by this or that by a cause. That is also determined by another, and this again by another, and so to infinity." Unquote. This is because human beings are all part of the same deterministic nature in God. For Spinoza, the world is the infinite and eternal manifestation of God's will. And although every event is necessitated by previous causes and the laws of nature, there is a sense of inevitability or predetermination about this view that conflicts with teleology. That is, in the standard Judeo-Christian view, the world is working towards a certain goal. And Spinoza also applies his opposition to natural teleology to human life. Spinoza holds that nature is indivisible, eternal or self-caused, and a unique substantial whole which is God. This unified, unique and necessary nature means that there is no teleology in the universe. Stephen Nadler writes, God or nature does not act for any ends, and things do not exist for any set purposes. There are no final causes. God does not do things for the sake of anything else. This rejection of teleology could have radical implications for meaning and purpose, seen as closely related. On the view above, purpose-directed behaviour could be seen as antithetical to the ideal character of God. And whereas meaning is attainment in the present, purpose is the lack of that attainment of meaning. And unexpectedly, Nietzsche and Sartre also have qualms about justification from the future. Yet again, for different reasons than Spinoza's. Both this determinism and opposition to teleology have serious ethical implications of limiting human freedom. That is, events in our minds are simply a causal series of ideas like any other natural events. And freedom can only consist in following a rational course of inexorable action. In place of free will, Spinoza explains that by will he means a faculty of affirming or denying. That is, affirming or denying the adequate truths about the world that follow in a logical manner. And such affirmations or denials are cognitive rather than affective faculties. I would like to briefly compare this constraint on free will to a form of affirmation with two other interpretations. One is the idea of free will as identification with reasons for action, which thereby makes us free. Another is an affirmation of an underlying reality, but as an affirmation of value or value states. And this is the will to value leading to an aggregation of value and a sufficiency of value. I mention this in order to open Spinoza's view to other possible interpretations. Another interesting aspect of Spinoza's concept of will is that the will is not, in fact, a faculty at all. He holds that such supposed faculties are, I quote, universal notions which are distinguished from the singulars from which we form them. These are particulars of the universals of the kind posited by Plato and Descartes. What is interesting here is that when Spinoza's metaphysics is removed, we have an insight about the will. That is, cognition, affect and value can be unproblematically defined as mental states or faculties. But the will isn't a state that can be pursued. It's a relation or a process towards an end. And the force of intent required to motivate action can be described as the will. I mention this to show some agreement over the peculiarity of the will. Yet these different conceptions of will and free will result from very different conceptions of moral responsibility. On Spinoza's view, one difference is that morals depends on much more on knowledge than on virtue. Another is an emphasis on education and rectification rather than moral judgment or approbation. And these trends certainly follow the inclinations of modern moral trajectories. That is, even if we disagree with Spinoza's deterministic view of human action. On the question of the theory of human action or motivation of why people do things, Spinoza allows the affirmation or denial of reality as part of an inevitable logical process. This is a cognitivist account of motivation as held by Kant and opposed by Hume's non-cognitive account. I usually give an example by asking, do we eat an apple because we desire it, or just because we see an apple? In this case, non-cognitivist motivation from desire is intuitively compelling, but moral motivation is more difficult and complex to ascertain. I have, for example, previously noted that the idea of truth makes special obligations on the human will, and Spinoza is also asking us to affirm reality. But that affirmation isn't as straightforward as it seems. Firstly, reality can't be set forth as straightforwardly as Spinoza supposes. Secondly, there are problems like Hume's objections to cognitive ethics or motivation. Such are underlined by Nietzsche's view that the truth is ugly. Practical ethical arguments can also be made against the obligatory power of truth. For example, it is true that I'm going to die, but it can be well argued that I'm better off denying this truth. Isaiah Berlin made a similar argument about the ambivalent value of knowledge. Another question is, how do these different things or states like cognition, affect and value engage the will? For Spinoza, the will is the same as the intellect or cognition. And like Kant, he can claim that whatever engages the intellect or cognition also engages the will. But the above examples argue against this view. Also, in theories of ethics, we have noted that an underlying theory of mind often portends a particular ethics. Kant's rationalist theory of mind, for example, underpins his rationalist theory of ethics. Conversely, Hume's empiricist theory of mind precedes a theory of ethics based on felt experiences. Yet Spinoza's theory of mind isn't straightforward, because for him the human mind is an aspect of the mind of God. But this metaphysical principle is in some ways a gloss that doesn't apply in practical matters. For example, Spinoza denies the immortality of the soul, which is also a claim about mind. More metaphysically, Spinoza holds a dual aspect theory of mind. That is, he defines mind and matter as two of an infinite number of modes of a single existing substance, and he ultimately identifies that substance with God. But a secular version of dual aspect theory is much harder to maintain. This is because it needs to postulate an underlying substance that can be expressed as both mind and matter. And others like Thomas Nagel have had doubts about its implications for consciousness and personal identity. Nagel asks, for example, how can I be a complex physical object? How can my subjective identity over time be determined by the objective identity of an organism? How can experiences inhere in something with physical parts? And how can sensations have physical properties? Unquote. And as previously noted, theories of ethics depend on certain values that are substantiated by theories of mind. And paradoxically, Spinoza is often regarded as an anti-realist about morals and moral values. He writes that as far as good and evil are concerned, they also indicate nothing positive in themselves, considered in themselves. Yet he also qualifies good and evil as useful in attaining good and preventing evil. So Spinoza, John Mackey and myself can agree that there are no intrinsic values in the fabric of the world. Yet, as noted earlier, we can arrive at similar conclusions for very different reasons. Spinoza doesn't believe in intrinsic values due to the deterministic nature of things. Mackie doesn't believe in intrinsic values due to the subjective character of values. In conclusion, we can ask again whether Spinoza's ethics has anything to offer modern moral philosophy. Firstly, its outstanding feature is a metaphysics that is heavily reliant on a certain conception of God. But the existence of God is already heavily contested in the modern world. Yet Spinoza's conception of God also employs concepts that are widely rejected. These include an optimism about social harmony, the idea of essence, an underlying metaphysical order, and even the idea of metaphysics itself. Yet many of Spinoza's tenets are still favoured by some schools of philosophy. These include cognitivist and rationalist theories of explanation, as well as a determinist theory of action underpinned by a physicalist account of causality. Yet that isn't to say that these contemporary accounts themselves aren't contested, but this has been an examination of Spinoza's ethics, not arguments about its underlying theories. Yet one of Spinoza's theories of motivation had parallels with my own view. This is significant from the perspective of philosophy as mythology that I have discussed before. That is, some philosophical theories are half-formed, nascent ideas that require completion. My favourite example is the history of the idea of God emerging later in the form of humanism. In Spinoza's case, we have what he calls the cognitive principle that is a driving force that can also be affirmed. Another example of such a principle is Nietzsche's will to power. But such principles have a lot of problems, like why should such a principle exist, and how can such a principle always exist in different human circumstances? And why should such a principle motivate and result in culminating satisfaction? To answer these questions, I have advanced the principle of a will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. On this view, a will to value and the possibility of its affirmation are brought into existence with consciousness, and its satisfactions are products of value like aesthetics, religion, ethics, meaning and purpose. Spinoza's moral philosophy, on the other hand, offers a very different perspective to that I advance here. It is based on principles that I cannot accept, and it produces judgments that are alien to my thinking. So let me have your comments or criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com.